A New Grammar or an Anti-Grammar of Revolution on Zapatismo and Open Marxism. An essay by Sergio Tischler in Open Marxism, Volume 4. Struggles and Elective Affinities. If there is a point where the political perspective of Zapatismo and the theorizing of Open Marxism converge, it is in the urgent need to change the existing world that's dominated by capital, and in the realization that anti-capitalist struggle for this change involves breaking with the traditional grammar of revolution. In other words, this affinity can be understood as a common perception of anti-capitalist struggle as a process that reinvents the very term revolution. From the moment of their uprising at the dawn of 1994, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation gave signs of bringing something new into revolutionary politics. In time, this became clearer. Their idea of revolution is not only different than the classic Leninist canon, it is actually profoundly critical of it. They don't fight to take power. Theirs is a revolution that makes revolution possible, for taking power doesn't guarantee a revolutionary transformation of social relations. Theirs is a revolution, quote, from below and to the left, unquote, one that focuses on autonomy. It is a political process that revolves around the experience of struggle to eliminate the relations of domination entrenched in the above of the rulers and the below of the ruled, and it is one expressed in a language that challenges the rigid forms of power, both of capital and of the power involved in the classic forms of organization of the left. In other words, Zapatista politics embraces a revolution against the grain, one that rejects the idea of a vanguard, so vital in the classic canon, as well as of political homogeneity. For its part, Open Marxism has been characterized by its criticisms of orthodox Marxism in its different variants, as well as of the theoretical perspective deployed by structuralist Marxism. One of the central aspects of this critique is directly related to the state and to the idea of anti-capitalist revolution. According to the theoretical argumentation of Open Marxism, there are many reasons why official communism failed to become a revolution that would emancipate humanity. The most significant, however, is its state-centric nature, which determined the authoritarian traits of the social transformation that took place in countries where a Leninist-inspired revolutionary vanguard was successful in taking power. At the same time, Marxism suffered a fundamental mutation. It went from being a critical theory of capital, providing a solid conceptual ground for a radical perspective on human emancipation, to being a state ideology. The main political thesis of Open Marxism is that a true anti-capitalist revolution cannot take place through the occupation of the state and its preservation as the fundamental political instance, an assertion based on the theoretical argument that the state is a form of capitalist social relations. The category of form is crucial in this approach for the analysis both of capital and of the state. It involves the need to radically rethink the concept of revolutionary politics and what we imagine as anti-capitalist change. Although the two are not directly related, for all the above-mentioned reasons, we consider there is a selective affinity, quote-unquote, between the political practice of Zapatismo and the theorizing of Open Marxism. While each retain its specificity, each in its own way, as the Zapatistas like to say, this affinity builds bridges and can on occasions create sparks that illuminate the path of asking we walk. However, the question remains whether stories so different can converge at a specific moment. I believe the answer lies in class struggle. The focal point of the stories is revolution, in particular its updating, and this updating is based on the awareness that the traditional grammar of revolution has been a grammar of power that has negated the verb of emancipation. Are we then on the verge of a new grammar of revolution, or of something different, a revolution as the anti-grammar of power? We have chosen to highlight these two stories for the reasons already explained, but we are well aware that many different stories converge in the field that Zapatismo has opened up. The Jungle and the Thunderbolt. How do we see Zapatismo? How do we avoid the trap of a subjective perspective, or even worse, of one that objectivizes or positivizes it? It is a complex matter, one hard to tackle. Perhaps one way forward is to see ourselves within its experience, to use it as a mirror for our own reflection. What does it tell us, and how does it call to us in relation to the fundamental question of the struggle to change the world? The starting point for Zapatismo is digna rabia, dignified rage. Two words that sum up the pain of this world of oppression and the anger we carry within. transformed by the Zapatistas into an organized will for change under the specific conditions prevailing in Chiapas. In fact, digna rebia is the driving force, the elementary flame of any transformation in an unfair world. It is what fuels revolutionary theory. It is not rhetoric. Is there dignified rage in capital? Without it, without the negative drift, this work might have been an objectivist treatise on capitalist reality, and never a critique thereof. In this sense, Holloway, 2002, is right in rejecting objectivist interpretations of Marx's work and defending the perspective of the negated scream of humanity in the categories of political economy. That said, we believe that to assume dignified rage as our starting point is, essentially, to say that the struggle does not begin from the concept but from something more basic that doesn't require theoretical legitimization. At its center lies the experience of specific struggles fought by ordinary men and women, which generates an empirically critical knowledge, one that is not necessarily mediated by theory and has memory at its core. This was understood by the members of the National Liberation Forces, FLN, when they entered the jungle of Chiapas and made first contact with the indigenous communities living there. As Marcos said in interviews held after the 1994 uprising, they had to, quote-unquote, learn to listen, and they learned how to listen to the dignified rage that came from the beginning of time. In doing so, they changed their mental habits that had been shaped by the tradition of leading they had learned through urban revolutionary experience and theoretical knowledge. They had to understand that this was a revolution of the indigenous and the peasants, and that they, the non-natives, should learn how to swim in the waters of this experience of resistance, how to comprehend its key elements, its codes. They had to admit that this other knowledge called the arrogance of the concept into question, demonstrating that if the latter wants to converse and go beyond abstractions, it must descend from its hierarchic pedestal and take a critical look at itself. In sum, it must learn. This challenged and thrust into crisis the idea of revolution as a universal model to be replicated, as an idea that subsumes the diversity of concrete struggles to a superior unity of a synthetic nature. It shook the perception of myth and of totalizing abstraction as symbolic and conceptual tools for revolutionary thought. However, to learn is not to strip oneself of certain content and fill oneself with another, just as we empty a glass of water so as to fill it with another liquid. In this specific case, learning to listen is part of an attitude of mutual recognition that opens up a process of exchange and transformation and takes a critical approach to the relatively closed codification of particular experiences of struggle. This has been the method of Zapatismo to date, spanning from that encounter in the Lacandan jungle to how it relates to other struggles, constituting a fundamental part of the idea and the process of constructing a we from below and to the left, which rejects any pretension of hegemony and homogeneity. What have they learned? What is the content of this learning? Many things can be said, of course, such as learning how to learn by forgetting what has been learned already. As we cannot make detailed reference to this knowledge in all its variety, we'll focus on a fundamental element of Zapatista practice and thought, which, in a way, encompasses the rest. We will speak of the anti-vanguardist idea of revolution and of some of its plans. Through their spokespersons, and mostly Subcommandant Marcos, now Galeano, the EZLN have asserted that they are not a model to be replicated, and that the notion of a revolutionary vanguard has no place in their idea of politics and revolution. Beyond their communiques, the significance of this anti-vanguardist idea of anti-capitalist change can also be traced to the practice of Zapatismo, to instances such as the other campaign, Otra Campaña, the autonomic process of the caracoles and the good government councils, Juntas de Buen Gobierno, and the Little Zapatista School, Escuelita Zapatista, amongst others. All this is well known. What is less well known is all that relates to the specific core of the experience expressed in the Zapatista way of doing knowing. How does this anti-capitalist struggle unfold as anti-vanguardist struggle through this doing knowing? Clearly, Zapatista anti-vanguardism is not derived from an abstract theoretical formulation, or from an idea that is one-sidedly articulated in the field of theory and aspires to guide practice. At the center of this concept lies a resignified community experience that is expressed in the fundamental guiding principles of Zapatismo. This experience is in itself very complex, and perhaps its intimacy renders it inaccessible to those of us who are not at the heart of it. However, to serve the purpose of this chapter, and having expressed our caution, we shall highlight two aspects that we consider fundamental. Firstly, the understanding that community revolves around the axis of resistance and struggle against oppression. From this perspective, the community is no longer viewed as a continuum of shared practices of resistance in times of domination, but as the conscious production of a temporality of rupture of domination, one that feeds off the memory of ancestral struggles and involves the resignifying of practices of resistance. In addition, it is well known that this process is not the result of one isolated experience restricted to the field of local resistances. Other struggles and experiences come into play, such as those of the already mentioned FLN. To put it plainly, the members of the FLN were forced to question and shed their vanguardism along the way, and the communities had to do the same with their localism. It was this dialogue and mutual questioning, this mutual mediation, that led to the emergence of this anti-vanguardist character of the EZLN and its anti-capitalist idea of change. This process also bears testimony to the profound effect of the general crisis of the hegemonic concept and of the classic canon of revolution. The profoundness of the change brought about by this mutual mediation can be perceived, amongst other things, in the horizontal relation between an experience whose main form of expression is orality and one that is codified in written terms. Within the classic canon of revolution, there is a hierarchic connection between the two, with written experience relating to the oral form in terms of hegemony. However, it would be wrong to positivize this experience. We believe the Zapatista anti-vanguardist idea of revolution must be considered the expression of a politics that emerges from negation, from the negation of capitalism, the negation of vanguard and hegemony, the negation of the patriarchate, among many others. It is a politics that opens up a horizon on the basis of all that is rejected. It posits the opening of the world towards an anti-capitalist experience that defies the tendency to homogenization and the idea of revolutionary political action as producing a new synthesis of power. This politics is at the same time the negation of the state, considered the expression of the separation between the leaders and the led, the rulers and the ruled, hegemony and the subaltern. For Zapatismo, we believe, awareness of this separation is crucial to the understanding of politics as a process of domination and of estrangement from the collective. That is why its main premises create a type of consciousness which aims at avoiding this separation and at creating horizontal processes that tend to eliminate what they call the above and the below in politics and in society. A movement from below and to the left suggests an anti-synthetic subject made out of multiple struggles which, in dialogue, produce a mutual knowledge of the common. This subject doesn't fix its rebel flow on one point so as to autonomize itself from it and establish itself as an institution. It is rather part of the flexible updating of the anti-capitalist flow in an anti-instrumental perspective of politics. Its goal is not to take state power. Its ideas of government and democracy are anchored in a practice that sets out to dissolve the determinations of power that have led to the separation of the above and the below, as one can observe at the local level in the autonomous experience of the good government councils. Generally speaking, in the context of a, quote, world where many worlds fit, unquote, the Zapatista proposal is fueled by an idea of emancipation in which the government is part of the social flow towards collective self-determination. It does not try to capture it within the political synthesis of the state. In other words, the anti-capitalism of Zapatismo is one that detotalizes. It does not set out to substitute capital with another totalizing form of domination, as occurred with so-called real socialism. It swims against the grain of the classic revolutionary tradition codified in Leninism, for in this tradition the idea of the hegemony of the vanguard entraps the meaning of class struggle within a totalizing form of power that ultimately negates social emancipation. This trait of Zapatismo also manifests itself in the rejection of personality cult of leaders, fueled by the subalternity of the ruled, as well as in its criticism of the exaltation and mystification of the sacrifice of emblematic figures. Perhaps one of the most accomplished expressions of this critique can be found in Between Light and Shadow, written by Marcos in 2014. Years before, in a magnificent interview with the subcommandant Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, 1999, also pointed out the significance of the use of masks for the Zapatista revolution. class struggle, and the category of form. On what points could the Zapatista experience and open Marxism converge? We must not lose sight of the already mentioned above differences that rise from the fact that the two are experiences with very different stories to tell, stories that distinguish them from one another. The history of Zapatismo is deeply rooted in the resistance of the indigenous peoples and in armed struggle for socialism in Mexico. Open Marxism, for its part, is a theoretical current especially recreated in critical academic circles, one that aims at updating Marxism as a critical theory and as a core element in the re-elaboration of revolutionary practice. In this sense, its subject matter is anti-capitalist revolution, and its current existence against the historical backdrop of the failure of so-called state-centered socialist revolution, particularly the criticism of the theoretical weaving of the latter. However, a broader look at these experiences reveals common features that allow them to enter into dialogue as part of a below and to the left. In fact, many of the more recent reflections of open Marxism have arguably drawn their inspiration from the Zapatismo experience, and have been shaped within the context of the failed revolutions in Central America and other parts of Latin America. In this chapter, dialogue will revolve around the conceptual re-elaboration of revolution proposed by open Marxism on the basis of the category of form. The concept of form lies at the center of Marx's analysis in Capital and in the main axis of the critical argumentation of open Marxism on domination and the state. For lack of space, we cannot offer a detailed analysis of this concept in the present essay. Such a deconstruction would involve considering the dialectic between form and content, essence and appearance, or the problem of fetishism and reification, amongst others. We shall limit ourselves to certain general considerations, leaning towards an issue that is eminently political, that is, the critique of politics and of the state as part of form. For Marx, capital isn't a thing. It is a social relation of domination/exploitation that necessarily manifests itself through forms, such as commodity form, money form, factory form, etc. The latter appear as autonomous, but are in fact part of the contradictory movement of value, creating a unity that is mediated by money. Resultantly, forms constitute a totality that is deployed as part of the movement of social reproduction dominated by abstract labor. In a broader sense, forms are real abstractions, Sohn-Rethel, 1978, and the domination built on them assumes the characteristics of an objective domination, Postone, 1996. An impersonal domination inscribed in the object that gives these abstractions a neutral appearance. However, it is quite the opposite. They are a specific historical form of capital domination, and therefore of the negation of the freedom of human beings, if this is understood as an individual and collective self-determination free of personal or objective coercion. A negation that appears as formal freedom in the commercial wage relationship established between those who sell their labor force and those who buy it. According to Holloway, forms are frozen or rigidified modes of existence of social relations, 2002, 51, that cut off or negate the doing of people by transforming it into labor through the wage relationship, that is, by the force of objective compulsion to which people are submitted in order to sell their labor force. This compulsion is part of a social relation that is based on the separation of the workers from the means of production as analyzed by Marx, and the process of primitive accumulation of capital, reproduced in the capitalist relation once this has been established. Bonefeld, 2014. The process of reification that manifests itself is objective domination, and in the forms is not limited to the economy. As we've seen, this process is a social totality that doesn't leave politics or the state untouched. The very separation of the economic and the political that characterizes bourgeois domination involves a type of relationship that is understood based on forms. The categories of civil society or citizenship, for example, cannot be perceived if not on the basis of the separation of the economy and politics. However, when the separation is positivized, it implies a process of fetishization. The concept of form breaks with this process in that it unveils the relation that exists in the separation of the economic and the political, and reveals this separation as a constituent element of capital domination. Thus, the concept of form allows for an understanding of the state as a form of social relations, and more specifically as the political form of capital. Bonefeld, 2014. It is clear that this perspective involves a critique directed against the liberal conceptions of the state. However, the critique is aimed mainly at orthodox and structuralist Marxist conceptions of the state, which consider the latter to be relatively autonomous from capital. This idea is either supported by a perception of the state as part of a superstructure ultimately determined by the economy, or by a mere complex and sophisticated structuralist approach that interprets it as a specific structure that is relatively autonomous from the economic structure. Both perspectives led to a state-centered politics, and a view of social transformation that is determined by this centrality. In this sense, they embrace grammars of power, and not languages of emancipation. On the contrary, Open Marxism regards revolution as a challenge for humanity to dissolve all forms, the state included, given that they are specific expressions of the rule of capital. According to this perspective, class struggle is not outside forms. It is one of their constituent elements. The state-centered versions of social change interpreted class struggle as the struggle to establish a new power, the power of the workers represented by the party. This led to the enclosure of the concept of class struggle within forms and to its taking an ideological and instrumental turn. In practical terms, it translated as a politics that, far from expressing social emancipation, constituted its negation. A new grammar or an anti-grammar. In our case, the terms grammar and anti-grammar are in no way related to deconstructionism and to its decentering of texts as an individualist act. Buck Morse, 1981. The terms are suggested in Angel Rama's The Lettered City, 1996. In his work, Rama posits the idea that, ever since the colonial period, grammar and written language in Latin America have been the legacy of scholars in the service of power. While there have been significant changes, such as those caused by revolutionary changes, this has been a constant that has determined the vertical codification of language, creating a true antinomy between a language from above and a language from below, a written and an oral culture, a dominant culture and a subaltern one. In other words, Rama argues that the grammarization of language and culture has been pivotal in the weave of power and hegemony. However, he doesn't deny the importance of written language. He rather questions its placement at the service of domination and therefore at the production of subalternity. How to transform it into a language of life and break the abstract carcass of a grammar that is at the service of power? This is the question that Rama asks, leading us, in turn, to the question of the language of revolution. Should it be codified in terms of a new grammar, or should the flow of rebelliousness against the system invent a language that goes against the grain of this codification? Should theory be the grammar of practice, or should it emancipate it from the imperialism of the concept, quote-unquote, Adorno, 1990. Decades ago, in their critical analysis of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno, 1972, untangled the relation between identity and the domination that hides under the neutral guise of the concept, and showed that the latter is part of the conceptual grammar of the system, that is, of the set of social relations that are dominant in an antagonistic society. By antagonistic society, they meant specifically the capitalist one, but the critique also involved the ongoing ideological and political process taking place in the Soviet Union. The lesson that emerged from that critique was that an identitarian concept is a damaged concept, an idea analyzed by Adorno in Negative Dialectics, and cannot be revolutionary, for it is part of a process of homogenizing the world and bringing about the universal domination of instrumental reason, Horkheimer, 1974, that resembles capital valorization. This theorizing spoke of the effects of a process of conceptual positivization of Marxism, which was already underway during the years of the Second International, and which concluded in the conversion of Marxism-Leninism into a state ideology. Through this cultural and ideological process, Marxism was transformed into a science, a positive science, the so-called science of the proletariat, adopting the conceptual parameters of a markedly positivist materialism. Somewhere along the way, it lost its critical edge and went from critical theory to positive theory, traditional theory, according to Horkheimer's definition, 1972. Part of this critique had already been formulated by Walter Benjamin, 2006. We could go on with more arguments like those above. However, What interests us here is to highlight all that creates a shared conceptual field between the cited authors, the concept of form that is at the center of Open Marxism, and the Zapatista experience. It seems to us that here there is a point of convergence resembling a constellation, in search of a language of emancipation. One could say that this constellation encourages the breaking of grammar as a language of power, in revealing it as the expression of a homogenizing and totalizing practice, as a form of social relations. Language imprisoned within a grammar of power cannot be an expression of a process of social emancipation, for it is part of its negation. In this sense, there is an urgent need to emancipate language from the form that turns it into a grammar of power and domination. Walter Benjamin possibly had a similar problem in mind when he spoke of the language of Adam as opposed to the language of men. The latter is a damaged language, one that cannot name the process of human emancipation, for it presupposes the separation between subject and object, and therefore constitutes a mere instrument, and not a means of redemption. This language is incapable of being a means for true expression, for a politics in the here and now that could open up time. In any case, to name revolution today is to name it in another language. This language must arise from the breaking of form as the expression of capital domination, and it must have an anti-instrumental and detotalizing character. It must interrupt the flow of domination that turns it into an instrument of yet another process of totalizing social relations. The Zapatista's experience and its modes of expression have paved the way in this regard. Grammar or anti-grammar? This is an open question. Our chapter wants only to ask this question, following in the footsteps of Zapatismo's Asking We Walk.